Yeah. Okay, so now, Deborah, well, let me ask you one question first, because today's LA Times had an article about violence related not to drug trafficking, but electoral violence in Mexico, and talked about in Veracruz. And how big an issue is that? And is it different than in previous elections?
I don't think it's a driving issue by any means. As in elections in many democracies around the world, there does tend to be some violence associated with the run-up to polling and even at the polling places. I think the bigger issue for Mexico by far has to do with the overall security situation, the impact that that has on the cost of doing business in Mexico, and I think it's also one of the question of who and how to most effectively deal with that is something that's a driving issue, I think, in this presidential campaign. There is, I think, a widespread sense amongst many Mexicans that the PRI has been able to deal successfully with the narcos in the past, in the sense of when the PRI was running things, there wasn't that kind of violence. And I think there's a great hope that if the PRI comes into power, that the violence can diminish, because certainly the violence has been something that in a very brief period of time, really, if you're looking in historical terms, has transformed the country. It's transformed the way people live. It's become an issue that now boards of companies look at, the cost of security measures. It wasn't 10 years ago. I'm often asked whether or not the violence, the narco violence in Mexico, has affected direct foreign investment. The answer that I give is there's the anecdotal story here and there of companies that have decided not to invest in Mexico, but by and large, if you look at the direct foreign investment figures, what you see is the companies that have been investing in Mexico, the foreign companies that have been investing in Mexico, continue to invest in Mexico. If you look at the drop in direct foreign investment that we saw in 2009, that reflects much more the worldwide recession than it does violence in Mexico. It's hard to untangle all of these things, but for the moment, I think the real question about the impact of violence on direct foreign investment decisions has to do with increasing what are in effect non-productive costs. It makes Mexico less competitive. It might be a different question, and I'll just throw this out as something for you all to ponder, what impact it might have on Mexican investors. I mean, just from a strict standpoint of portfolio diversification, you can say, well, for a multinational company, their investment in Mexico might be, what, 2–3% of their portfolio of investments. For a Mexican investor, it's probably much closer to 100% of their portfolio investment. This region, I think, is one that has seen an influx of Mexicans.
This region meaning San Diego?
Yes.
Okay.
As well as Texas and other parts of the United States. But the question is, when people are moving their families to parts of the United States and traveling back home to do business, well, for how many generations will that last? And when you're thinking about where to put your next investment, where do you do it? So I think the issue of the effect of violence on investment is one that bears a great deal of analysis, but I would argue that the impact should be much more examining what impact it has on Mexican, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, as opposed to the impact on multinational.
That's great. That's great. Cecilia, oil prices are down to, what, $88 a barrel yesterday, something like that. What does that do to renewables and other sorts of, what's the impact of that on Mexico?
Actually, the oil prices don't have as much impact as the natural gas prices, because renewable energy is usually for electricity. And I was at a meeting with it was like a summit with the governors of Sonora and Arizona, and they talked a lot about that. But what people don't understand, what we're talking about is actually the U.S. Doing liquid natural gas and sending it to Mexico, because natural gas has gotten so cheap. It's like $2 per BTU.
It's like correct me if I'm wrong, but the factoid that sticks in my mind is that for the same amount of energy, gasoline costs 7 times what natural gas costs. Is that right?
Right, something like that. But before, natural gas tracked oil. So when the oil prices went up, natural gas went up. But because of the new discoveries in the U.S. and, fracking and all that, so the price, it no longer tracks that way. And the Mexican states, at least, they like that, especially the ones on the border, because they're the ones who are having a lot of problems with energy. So that's the conversation that they're having right now, because in past, I heard, Mexico talk about nuclear and doing that. They do want a diversification. Who wouldn't, right? But they were not looking at solar energy, for example, so it's too expensive. But nuclear maybe. Now, I don't hear them talk about nuclear. Now it's, importing natural gas, or, getting more natural gas in the mix. But at the same time, what I was encouraged by, and we talked about the elections, but there's a very, very key element here, and that is the governors. The states are very influential, which is really hopeful for me, too, because the governor of Baja California and now the governor of Sonora is really, they're trying to push more renewables, even though the prices of natural gas are low. And the reason why, in my understanding, is mostly because they do want to diversify the mix of resources. They want to get as much as they can in-house, and also they want economic development.
Okay. For people here who may not know the answer to this question, and it's sort of a civics question, but the governors in Mexico and the state governments in Mexico have more power than state governments in the United States. Yes? No?
I don't know
Francisco,
who answered that.
That's actually a dangerous question.
They're very influential. How's that? They're extremely influential.
I think one of the very fascinating things about Mexico's democratization process has been the changing role of governors over the last, say, 20 years or so. Back when Carlos Salinas de Gortari was president, he would still impose and depose governors at his will. And some could say when, but the president made the decision, really, as to who was going to be governor for how long. That isn't the case anymore. As you've seen power devolving from the presidency is clearly not as powerful as an institution now as it was 20 years ago. And what you've seen is part of decentralization has been governors have acquired more power than they had before. And so in a certain sense, states have become more like fiefdoms than they were before. Would you?
I think it's, I think it's a great point, and it comes back to this thing I talked about, the challenge of major reform of the oil sector in constitutional reform gets to the state level, and that's really where things get challenging, especially the oil-producing states, and the issue of the revenue, and the issue of employment, the issue of the unions. Yep.
Well, and just in terms of investments, is someone from SEMPRA here? I think you had an issue with local authorities, no? Stopping an investment for a while. So it's not just state level now. Before you could say, if the federal level says this is happening, it happened. Francisco, would you agree?
You say it better than I can.
He's also a diplomat and has to be very careful.
That's right. Put a microphone in front of him, right?
But
I totally agree.
Okay, Jeremy, I have to admit, I look at everything through my experience in Venezuela, where the per capita consumption of energy keeps growing, so that even if oil production remains constant, exports drop, right? Is that happening in Mexico? The economy's growing 3% a year.
Well, there's definitely issues, right? And then, there's issues of refining capacity. There's issues of the fuels. There's subsidy issues. And again, this is something, let's have the economists talk a little bit about that. And there's a campaign underway to try and take on the subsidies. Mexico is part of the OECD. There's a commitment in Pittsburgh What year was the G20? What year was the G20 meeting? Anyway, Mexico is part of an international commitment to reduce subsidies in energy. These things all are relevant to the energy picture, the fiscal, the interconnection I mentioned between energy and fiscal issues. I think what you don't see in Mexico necessarily that you see in Caracas is somebody driving around in the 73 Barracuda because, you know, it's 50 cents to fill it up every other day.
Yeah. Also, the new law, the climate change law, has that as part of the goal is to reduce the subsidies for fossil fuels, which everybody thinks that's really controversial, but yet everybody voted for it. So it seems, you know, they have to just do something about it.
Yeah, and again, this issue of the discrepancy between who receives the benefit of a subsidy, you know, in how it enters into the economic system of the country is important. Well,
I think something that's important to point out is that gasoline prices, whatever the price of oil is, gasoline prices in Mexico just go up. And how quickly they go up is the result of a decision taken in the finance ministry and the economic cabinet about how much income the government needs and how much they can afford to subsidize. You know, it's hardly surprising. It's a case in any democracy. Mexico isn't unique, but, you know, an election comes around and gasoline prices tend to increase less than in non-electoral years. The issue of the subsidy is an important one. I think what will do it is not so much issues of equity as simply necessity. If you want to know how you can decrease your budget deficit at the same time that you're increasing expenditures while still having tax revenues is the lowest percentage of GDP in an OECD country, the answer is simple: high oil prices. Yeah. So Mexico is facing this question of sooner rather than later becoming a net oil importer. And the question is, how do you subsidize the loss of revenues from oil? That, I think, is one of the reasons that we're seeing the questions about how Pemex works being addressed. I think that you'll see that the way the subsidy is dealt with is that gasoline prices are just raised more each year than they would have been otherwise to help compensate for the lack of revenues. Because although Mexico's budget deficit right now is very small as a percentage of GDP, even
smaller than the U.S.
Oh, much. Even including Pemex investments, it's 2.5% of GDP. You know, that's when you've got revenues growing less rapidly than expenditures, that's not sustainable. Oil prices go down and you've got big issues looming. So, you know.
Is electricity subsidized?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Any popular consumption items are subsidized, no? So how do you address a growing budget deficit or a long-term issue in the public finances? You can increase revenues, always difficult to do. You can cut expenditures, very difficult to do. Or you can increase the deficit. And whoever is elected, I think is going to have to face that issue, and probably we'll see some combination, I don't know if you all would agree, of increasing revenues, increasing taxes on those who pay taxes, yeah, and increasing deficits.
Okay. While we talk a little bit more, if you've got a question, write it on the card, hold it up, and Amy, are you the card collector? Yeah, or somebody.
You are now.
Yeah, okay. If somebody would collect the cards and bring them up here so I can ask your questions, that would be great. Maybe it's Bernabe who's the card collecting gentleman.
A point on that oil price issue. I think Pemex, or I should say Mexico has been cushioned by the high oil price, because I talked about that decrease in production, 2004 until today. Well, line that up on a chart with oil prices, and luckily for Mexico, you had a decrease in production the same time you had a major spike in oil prices on the global market. And then you had a nice deal that I don't even understand, that the finance minister at the time, a couple years ago, hedged the bet on the price of oil.
Oh, they do that. They've always done that. To me, it's one of the very fascinating things. Essentially, what the Mexican government has been doing for a number of years. We didn't know this until the bet paid off.
Until it worked, yeah. Right. When it worked, it was public, yeah.
I mean, it's a very reasonable and good strategy. But what they've been doing is been buying. They've been hedging the price of oil at the price that's included in the budget. So if you have a sudden drop in oil prices, you're covered in terms of your budgeted expenditures. Something that's very interesting to me is, we didn't know about it until the bet paid or the hedge paid out. But isn't it fascinating? I mean, this isn't cheap. This is a couple $2 billion maybe to hedge oil prices, and depending on the volatility of the markets, of course, and other factors going into hedging prices. But isn't it interesting that that kind of money can be spent by the Treasury? Nobody knows about it.
Just do it.
It's done.
Good. Let me ask, and I'm just going to throw this out for whoever wants to answer. How do you see whoever wins the election, what will be the impact on U.S.-Mexican relations? Is that a David Out question?
Jeff, oh, no, okay, yeah, that's definitely his question.
Okay. Well, go ahead, Deborah.
No, I think that obviously, the first thing I would say is that although it's very nice to have good personal relationships between presidents, that's not the key to the success of the bilateral relationship. The bilateral relationship is much too complex, multifaceted, long-standing, layered, deep, whatever adjective you want to use, for that to make a lot of difference. I think that the issues that are on the table now, in terms of free trade, I don't think that's going to change the 21st century frontier. I think that that'll move forward. How much will be invested in it could vary. But the big difference, I think, actually has to do with, and this will put it back in the U.S. corner, who's going to be elected president in November, and what will their economic policy be? Because we all know that Mexico's growth rate is very much influenced by the rate of growth in the U.S.
Sure. Here's a governance question. Just for the sake of the discussion, let's assume the polls are correct, and you've got the same party, the PRI, both in the controlling the presidency and both I can't speak, houses of Congress. What does that ability to govern without the Congress disagreeing with the presidency, is that good? Is it bad? Is it going to, would we see huge changes as a result of that? Now, again, I throw that out to whoever is brave enough to answer. Why don't you start?
Well,
And pull the microphone a little bit closer. So
okay. Well,
don't just look at him all the time.
Oh, sorry. I'm gonna look at everybody. All right. So I don't think. Again, Peña Nieto is really smart, and the people in the PRI are very smart. I think that if they look at what policies are working, I just cannot see any precedent just saying, I just don't like it, or I'm going to do my own thing. The economy is has been very vibrant for so many years. The exchange rate has remained very steady. So if they do anything to upset that, I was just thinking about that too a few months ago, that look at China when they took back Hong Kong. Everybody expected just a disaster, yet the Chinese were really smart about that, and they handled it well. So I think that, this is a much lesser issue to have the PRI go back, and I would just say that I don't foresee a major change, basically. I don't.
You may want to add to that? Because I've got a handful of questions, great questions here, too.
Well, very quickly, I think that the political abilities of whoever is elected, and at this point, the race in Mexico is really a race for second place. But, whoever is, Enrique Peña is the most likely winner of the election. But what he has demonstrated as governor of the state of Mexico is that he's a very capable politician. If you're working with a Congress that your party controls, I think that's definitely a plus in terms of your ability to get things done. But whoever is elected president, and this is as true for Mr. Peña as it's been for Mr. Calderon, you've got to also deal with, as it were, the de facto powers in Mexico, and that can limit, as is the case in any democracy, but that can limit what you can hope to get done.
The de facto powers, would you like to explain that?
Sure. I mean, you could call them vested interest. You could call them any number of things. I think we saw, for example, very recently, an illustration of that in terms of the Solomonic decision to allow Usacell and Azteca to move forward, with the proviso that a third television channel be allowed into Mexico. And you have very important economic interests in Mexico, be they public sector unions, be they the television bloc in the chamber and Senate. You know, you certainly can't ignore the interests of Mr. Slim, whoever you are. There are a lot of groups in Mexico, as in any democracy, that can affect public policy, and you can't ignore them. I mean, we saw that, for example, with the teachers' union recently, and this whole issue of whether or not you can bequeath your position or sell your position to someone else. The idea of merit testing for teachers, and the resistance with which that was met. Even Elba Ester Gordillo, who is very powerful, was not able to shove that down the throat of the teachers in Oaxaca or in Morelos.
Great. These are questions. I'm going to throw them out, and whoever wants to answer can. Number one, would the progressive left have done better with Marcelo Ebrard as a candidate than with López Obrador?
Well, what the heck, I'll start on that one. I mean, my answer is yes, I think so. I mean, you know, it's hard to say that right now because we see an AMLO surge, but I think if you look at sort of the repercussions of the 2006 shutdown of Mexico City and the protests and what happened in 2006, I think it would have been very useful for the PRD, but I think, you know, there's obviously a lot of political strategy at play here, so I understood why it didn't play out that way.
I would just say the left didn't think so, but you know, certainly there was, you know, Marcelo Ebrard is extremely popular in Mexico City, as witnessed by the success of his Delfin, his favored candidate, who's running for the mayorship of Mexico City. But it's one of those questions, I think, that you know, I think many people agree with your assessment, Jeremy. I think the question for Marcelo Ebrard is, now that he no longer has a public platform, how can he keep himself in the public eye until 2018?
Okay, and you've just answered question 2, Deborah, which was the Mexico City election. So you're saying El Delfin is a shoo-in.
Oh, he's got an even larger lead than Peña Nieto.
Yeah.
Okay, Jeremy, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No. The political strategery there was.
I thought you were quoting W. That was great.
That was.
Okay, good. Okay, this is for anybody. How will the change of the energy matrix impact oil production and consumption? It seems that the impact of alternative strategies is not really significant in the next 20 years. Is that correct?
Who asked that question?
I don't. It's an anonymous question. That's the advantage of the cards.
You know, I think the other thing that I didn't mention, we were talking about in Baja California, but in Mexico City and with the governor of Sonora is the electrification of vehicles. It's a big deal. They want to do that. So in Nissan...
I'm sorry, the electrification of...
Vehicles.
Vehicles, okay.
Yeah, and Nissan is looking at, you know, they already have a pilot program that bring into Mexico City to have some charging stations and things like that. So, again, Mexico is not under a rock. And the world markets are moving in that direction. It's not just the United States. I mean, San Diego, yes, is the test bed for Nissan Leaf, but if you look everywhere else, in Europe, in Japan, everywhere, you're seeing that shift because of the oil prices. If Mexico wants to stay a major economic force in the hemisphere, you have to, decide that you're not going to depend on oil. So I have to believe that. In terms of renewables, it has been slow, but there's been a lot of movement. There is a lot. In Baja California, there have been RFPs for solar energy, and solar is the least favorite of the Mexican policymakers because it's perceived to be the most expensive. But, I always argue that it's expensive on nominal, kilowatt hour, but when it's delivered, the other resources are more expensive too because you have to build transmission lines, and they can cost billions of dollars. And then if you have renewable energy at your house, then you don't need the transmission line. But anyways, but that's changing too. And the new law specifically asks for all these ministries to get together and design a program. I mean, it's very specific. That has never happened before. Before it used to be just something nice to do, but I think that as we in the renewable industry demonstrate the cost effectiveness of the technology, and as the technology prices continue to go down, it would be, Central America, El Salvador, I mean, Southeast Asia, Thailand is going into. I cannot see Mexico willing or seeing all these things, deciding to stay behind. I just cannot see that. But that is maybe my optimism. And I honest to God, I'm looking. We have a factory in Tijuana. And we built a new building, and this is during, the worst time in the crime and, the narco stuff going on in Tijuana. But we did it, and it's built, and we have reserved the second floor of that building to put lines there for the Mexican market. Because one of the reasons we built the factory there was, yes, it's close to the border, and we already have a factory there, but why we did it there and not in Arizona and other places was because we see Mexico becoming an important market. It has become a very important market for the solar thermal industry, and people do it with no rebates. In Mexico, we're looking at how do we incentivize people to put PV photovoltaic systems on their business and homes through loans rather than rebates. So I think that we're getting closer and closer.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to pause here for a advertisement, shameless self-promotion, and that is that the Institute of the Americas is going to have a conference in Mexico City when is it, Lee? It's in August. We have a date. It's sort of the third week in August, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, on electric vehicles, the introduction of electric vehicles in the federal district.
Yeah.
So, which should be great, and if any of you happen to be in Mexico City on those days, please attend. Okay, good.
I would just throw one thought onto that, and not to rain on anyone's parade here, but I think the timelines are getting pretty far pushed out for stuff in terms of fuel mix for transport sector. And I think Cecilia mentioned something earlier that I think is critical when you talk about renewable energy in Mexico, and that's natural gas in the United States, North America market, and the price. Because right now, it's causing a lot of thinking in Mexico by policymakers because of not just the price and the excedence of the excess capacity in the United States of natural gas, but the potential in Mexico because these shale plays, the formations, the geological formations that we're now ramping up in the United States, they don't stop at the border. So there's a fundamental natural gas question that Mexico will take on, and this is the fundamental question when it comes to energy diversification. Is natural gas complementary or competition in terms of renewables? And I think I don't think we have the answer yet.
Well, sorry, the other one that we haven't talked about is the biofuels. It has been very successful for Brazil, right? And Mexico has a lot of, agriculture, especially in the south, for biomass, for biofuels. So that's something I have not followed up, but I'm sure it's being discussed.
Yeah, there's a biofuel mandate, and there's certain things that can happen. But again, these are at the margins, I would suggest.
Yeah. Okay, great. Deborah, the New World Global Economics Prospects Report says Mexico's economic prospects are generally good, but number one, real interest rates are below normal, and two, loan to GDP ratio is growing. How do these two issues negatively affect growth, and how are they related to the election?
Well, I don't think low real interest rates would hurt growth. I think it would actually foster growth. I think, though, that one would expect real interest rates in Mexico, real meaning discounting inflation, to be low, simply because of the country's economic performance over the last literally couple of decades. If you look at how quickly we recovered from the most recent crisis, the crisis that was set off by the U.S. Financial sector debacle, we recovered very quickly. And that was a crisis that, in contrast to the '95 crisis, was one that in '95, exports saved us from a worse crisis. In 2009, exports made the crisis worse because the exports dropped about 25%. So the fact that interest rates are low, I think, should be taken as a sign, as a vote of confidence, really, in the country's performance. The fact that loan to GDP ratio is growing, I think the question is what kinds of loans we're looking at. The public sector debt, total public sector debt, foreign and domestic, is really quite a low percentage of GDP. I think it's about 26% right now. Incredibly low, the envy of most countries around the world nowadays. That the public sector debt has been rising lately while the private sector has been repaying net debt, or commercial banks, private commercial banks have been repaying net foreign debt, is a bit of a concern to me. I think it speaks the issue of growing public sector indebtedness, which is a reversal from what we had seen during the middle part of this decade. I think that really points to the longer-term fiscal issues to which I already referred, the fact that if oil prices don't stay at this level, even though production seems to have leveled off, we'll see, but essentially, the more rapidly the economy grows, what we've always seen in the past is more gasoline, more oil products are consumed domestically, and less is available for exports. If oil prices were to fall, Mexico is going to face a significant public sector debt issue. The public finances depend, I think the most recent figures are something like 34% of public sector revenues come from oil. That's pretty major. And you're also going to see an issue with the current account deficit. Why does that matter? Because the relationship between the current and the capital accounts are really what, in the end, should determine the exchange rate. We've had extraordinarily small current account deficits in recent years, under 1% of GDP, simply in large part because oil prices have been so high. So we're not going to have an immediate crisis on the current account deficit front, but if oil prices were to fall, the current account deficit would be much larger, which means you need to attract more foreign capital in order to have a stable exchange rate. So I think the issue of loans, if it's public sector debt, it's a concern because we've got this issue, fiscal issue in the future. In terms of private sector debt, if you look at bank lending as a percentage of GDP in Mexico, you find that it's a very low percentage of GDP, much lower than other Latin American countries. So the fact that you have bank lending to the private sector growing is actually a good sign. And if you look at the growth rate of of commercial bank lending to consumers and for mortgages, what you can see is that's been a factor that has helped to promote consumption, the growth of consumption in recent years. So I'm not sure to what the World Bank is referring. The context would be interesting to see.
Okay, great. I think we're going to pause here for a minute. Jeffrey Davidow has arrived from LA, so the traffic wasn't too bad. Or did you come by helicopter?
Manna from heaven.
Yeah. Anyhow, so we're going to take a minute and shift the panel. If anybody wants to get up and get a second cup of coffee right now, this would be a good time to do it.
Why don't you have Jeff speak from the podium?
Jeff, do you want to speak from the podium or here? Where do we, or from there?
From there is not an option. All right.
Table, okay.
Look at this, ready? Just like that.
Oh!
You were ready.
Oh, that's
I was a Boy Scout.
That's magic. How did you do that? That's great. So everybody, Jeff, come on up here and never, would you like to stay? Would you like to move?
Why don't you all stay here?